is a professor at
Indiana University.
Indiana, of course, and he's well known particularly for his work on free will and metaphysics generally, philosophy of mind. It's extremely distinguished in those areas, and I've been reading his stuff recently myself because I'm trying to write about free will, and it's extremely useful and important. And then Goff, who was at Liverpool after I taught there, and at Central European University when I taught there.
Okay.
So he was a colleague, but then he came back to England and is now interviewed on the television and the wireless almost every day of the week. One needs a special Facebook channel of one's own to take all Philip's things in, and he's tremendously active, but particularly famous, together with Galen Strawson, for the Pan-Psychism views, and particularly important in the development of Pan-Psychism from the original primitive theory, the smallism, as it were, to cosmopsychism, and now this agential Pan-Psychism. This is all fascinating, so I've hoped to have a really interesting paper from both this year.
Howard, there's a chair for you here if you want us.
Sorry, I've swapped us around by mistake, but okay, well thanks very much for the invitation. This is really enjoying this conference. It's a really nice interdisciplinary gathering. I want to talk to you today about the mystery of psychophysical harmony. There's something about 5 people are talking about at the moment, but I think it's going to change the world, so we'll see. But however, it's a hard problem to convey to people. And that's not because it's particularly technical or complicated. It's just, it doesn't seem like it's a problem. I'm going to suggest that there's something we need to explain. And what I'm suggesting we need to explain is such an obvious, mundane, seemingly trivial fact of human existence that it really doesn't feel like it needs explaining. George Orwell said something like, to attend to what's in front of one's nose requires constant effort. It's probably not exactly. I think something like this is going on here. Okay, so this is taken from my recent book, modestly titled "Why the Purpose of the Universe." Just say a little bit about that quickly. So it's pitched as a sort of middle way between theism and atheism. It's saying atheism understood as the view that we're in a purposeless, meaningless universe. And it's saying both of these worldviews everyone thinks you have to fit into one of these teams, but both of these views have things they can't explain. Theism struggles to explain suffering. Traditional atheism struggles to explain the fine-tuning of physics for life, and what I'm going to talk about today, psychophysical harmony. And then I explore a variety of middle ground options where there is cosmic goal-directedness, but in the absence of the traditional Abrahamic God. I'm not going to talk about fine-tuning, but it's come up quite a lot. So in the book, I press this charge that you can't explain fine-tuning in terms of a multiverse, that it's a fallacious inference. It commits what's called the inverse gambler's fallacy. This is something that's been in the philosophy literature for decades, but in typical case of philosophers talking to themselves, nobody outside of philosophy knows about it. And also what I do in the book is connect it to the science of the multiverse, which, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been done before, and try to say you don't get around the fallacy just by saying string theory is cool. Okay, so anyway, if people want to talk about that, I'd be very happy to. But today I'm talking about psychophysical harmony. So, the alleged mystery is we need to explain why our conscious experiences and behaviour paired together in a rationally appropriate way. So the most obvious examples involve pain and pleasure. When something feels bad, people tend to avoid it. When something feels good, you tend to go for it. Okay. Of course, not all things being equal, you can persevere through a pain for some greater reward, but obviously this is not just coincidental, the pairing of these things. But this is quite general. In general, our conscious experience represents certain things and we behave rationally with reference to those representations. If my visual experience represents a chair right here, I might sit down if I want to rest. That would be a sort of rational response to that representation. And in general, any historical or sociological explanation presupposes that people respond to their conscious beliefs and desires in a more or less rational way. So why do people vote? Why are people going to vote for such and such today? I thought the election was yesterday, so I can't vote, which I'm a bit gutted about. But anyway, we will give some account of how what they've done is a more or less rational response given their beliefs and desires. Okay, so as I say, this doesn't feel like it needs explaining. Why do you avoid things when they hurt? Just because they hurt. Doesn't seem like it needs explaining. But I think when you think very carefully about it, there is a mystery here. So I want you to bear with me and just take very seriously. I'm just going to, mainly focus on the most simple case. Think very carefully about this question for the whole talk. Why do people avoid things that hurt? And I'm going to just basically go through 7 different answers and say why actually each of them is problematic, and I hope we do realise it's a bit of a mystery here. Okay, so first answer, analytic functionalism. This is the view held kind of by influential philosopher David Lewis, pictured here. This is the view that conscious states are just defined in terms of what they do. So very roughly, pain just means a state which causes avoidance behaviour in response to bodily damage or something like that. That's just what we mean by pain. By analogy, poison is defined in terms of what it does, right? When we say something's poison, that just means it kills you when you ingest it. Okay, so this view makes the problem go away, right? Just like there's no mystery. How come all the poison kills people? Well, we wouldn't call it poison if it didn't. So if by pain we just mean a state that causes avoidance behaviour, then there's no mystery here. So this would completely solve the problem. Unfortunately, it's in my view at least, not a very plausible view. When I say, my wife's in pain, that isn't a claim about her behaviour or the behaviour of her parts. It's a claim about how she feels. And I take it that's a very different kind of claim to, it can't be at the level of meaning cashed out in terms of behaviour. I mean, I guess analytic functionalism would just say, yeah, I'm talking about feeling, but claims about feeling just are claims about behaviour. Lewis made that in the postscript of his Mad Pain, Martian Pain paper. But there's very strong intuition that that's just not what we mean when we talk about feelings and experiences. These are not just claims about behaviour. And for what it's worth, most philosophers agree with me on this, that the Phil Papers survey of 2020, 60% of philosophers, quite a consensus, philosophers don't agree on much. 60% think zombies are logically coherent. So zombies physically just like us, but with no consciousness. It doesn't mean they're possible, but that they're at least logically coherent, and that's just inconsistent with analytic functionalism, because they've got something that behaves just like someone who's in pain but doesn't actually feel pain. Because it's not a popularity contest, that doesn't sell anything, but it at least should give you pause for thought if there's a significant consensus of the relevant experts think this. In fact, you could take what I'm saying today as an argument for analytic functionalism, right? If all of the other options don't solve this problem, then maybe this is an argument for analytic functionalism. Still an interesting argument because it's not a very popular view. Oh, so only 16% of philosophers think zombies are incoherent. And the rest are sort of agnostic or whatever. Okay, that's analytic functionalism. So we're just going to go through explanations of why people avoid things that hurt. Okay, next explanation that I find comes up a lot online. I spend too much time on Twitter. Natural selection, right? Well, I definitely believe in evolution and think we evolved our conscious experience through the process of natural selection, but this doesn't solve the problem, because any evolutionary explanation of the character of our conscious experience already assumes an explanation of psychophysical harmony when you think about it. Natural selection only has a motivation to make me feel pain when my body's damaged if I'm going to respond rationally to that pain and avoid getting my body damaged, right? But that's the very thing we're trying to explain. Maybe I didn't emphasise this. What I'm suggesting is it's a rationally appropriate connection between pain and avoid. Pain gives you a reason to avoid. If something feels bad, that gives you a reason to avoid. And therefore, avoidance behaviour, all things being equal, is a rational response. So this is what we're trying to explain. How come behaviour and conscious experience are related in this rationally appropriate way? So any evolutionary view already assumes that you're going to respond rationally to your experiences and therefore doesn't explain it, or you'd be going around in a circle. And a way to perhaps see this more clearly is to think of a thought experiment of pain-pleasure inverts. So here's Ned Block, who famously discussed inverted Earth, where people have their colour experience inverted. It's a planet just like ours, except the experience people have when they look at bananas is just like the experience people have here when they look at tomatoes, and vice versa. We could think about a world of pain-pleasure inverts, so a strange universe where when people feel pain, that instigates attraction behaviour. When people feel pleasure, that instigates avoidance behaviour. In that universe, people would evolve to feel pleasure when their body's damaged, because that's going to cause them to avoid getting their body damaged, or feel pain when they eat or drink, and that would cause them to do those things, right? Now this feels more absurd, feels more ridiculous, but I want us to just think very carefully about what is it that's ridiculous about this. I suggest it's not a logical absurdity, right? There's no logical connection between how an experience feels and what it does. That would be the analytic functionalist answer we just considered. If there's no logical connection and we're just in a meaningless, purposeless universe, why should what conscious experiences do, the behaviour that results from them, be rationally appropriate? Right? Why should it be? So I think what's absurd about pain-pleasure inverts is that they're doing the opposite of what they have reason to do. Right? If you're in pain, that gives you a reason to avoid, and they're doing the opposite of that. But why should the behaviour that results from conscious states be rationally appropriate? Why should we need an explanation of that? Okay, next explanation. When are we taking the time from? Was it 7 minutes past? Or does anyone?
It's 7 minutes past.
7 minutes past, okay. Okay. So I'll go to 37 minutes past. Okay, next explanation, slightly more technical one maybe. Hedda Hasse-Merck, fellow panpsychist, has what's become known as the phenomenal powers view. She thinks there's an a priori discernible, metaphysically necessary causal connection between pain and trying to avoid. So she just thinks, so a priori accessible means just through reflecting on the concepts, you can see that there's this necessary connection between feeling pain and trying to avoid. But it's not just a definition, so this is not the analytic functionist, it's not just what we mean by pain, it's a substantive metaphysical connection between pain and trying to avoid, but you can see just through reflecting that these things are necessarily connected. That's her view. Okay, 2 problems with that. One, suppose Hedda's right that there is this metaphysically necessary connection between pain and trying to avoid. Well, there's also a rational connection. Avoidance is rationally appropriate if you're in pain, all things being equal. It seems to me, well, that's a bit of a coincidence. How come there are these metaphysically necessary causal connections that just happen to map onto rational connections? That seems like something that we need explaining. So my diagnosis of what's going on here is she's just misidentifying what is actually a rational connection. So there is a necessary connection here, but it's not a causal connection, it's just a rational connection. What is absurd about pain-pleasure inverts is not that they're infringing some necessary causal laws, they're just doing really irrational behaviour. The other problem, which Brian Cutter and Dustin Crummett, who I'm going to get to, have pointed out, that even if she's right, we've still got the question of, well, how does this connect to behaviour? So we could imagine a world where, people feel pain, they try to avoid. So they feel pain when they're when they feel pain, they try to avoid, but then that causes attraction behaviour. So we've still got the problem of psychophysical harmony there. Next explanation, slightly more technical, a posteriori physicalism. This is perhaps the most popular view in philosophy of mind on consciousness. Maybe Alyssa has something like this view, which is that there is an a posteriori necessary connection. Well, phrasing it to address this issue, they would say, I take it, that there's an a posteriori necessary connection between pain and avoidance behaviour. So no, we're exploring different possibilities about what this necessary connection might be, if there is one. The analytic functionists say it's just a definitional one, it's just what we mean by pain. Heder, Hassel-Merck says it's a necessary connection, but it's a priori. These physicalists say it's a necessary connection, but it's only known empirically through doing science. A bit like the connection between water and H2O is necessary, but discovered scientifically. This could go a couple of ways. It could be that pain is just identical to a brain state. C fibers firing, and C fibers firing has its causal powers essentially, sort of Aristotelian type view. Or it could be that there's an empirical identity between pain and some behavioural functional state. It's just not, so it's not about what we mean, it's a scientific discovery. Okay, well, I'm going to give an intuitive and a technical. I don't think this solves the problem, and I'm going to give an intuitive way of pressing that, and then a more technical way of pressing that. The intuitive way of pressing that is it just doesn't feel like an explanation, right? We're asking, how come conscious experience and behaviour are connected in this rational way? To say it just does necessarily doesn't feel any more satisfying than it just does, or they just are. Right? They just are necessarily, just doesn't feel like we've given an explanation there. But I think the fuller response is to say that when we're thinking of Bayesian probabilistic reasoning, which I'm ultimately going to get to here, but this is the context in which I'm thinking about this, the relevant kind of possibilities are epistemic, not metaphysical. So a couple of examples to illustrate that. Suppose you're on a game show and the prize is behind one of 3 doors, and you say, what's the odds it's behind door A? 1 in 3, right? But in terms of reality, there's no chanciness, right? The prize actually is behind one of the doors. So we're interested in chanciness at the level of what we know or epistemological situation. Okay, that's a situation where it's metaphysically possible that the prize could be behind other doors. But I think it's clear that in probabilistic reasoning, we will appeal to possibilities that are, in fact, metaphysically impossible. So, for example, think of like when we're thinking about what's the evidence that water is H2O, right? Just imagine you're evaluating the evidence. So you have the evidence, scientific evidence, and then we've got various hypotheses. The hypothesis that water is H2O, the hypothesis that water is a fundamental element, as the ancient Greeks thought, and you'll be seeing which of these hypotheses makes the evidence most likely. That's how you do Bayesian reasoning. But of course, most of these possibilities are actually, most of these quote-unquote are actually impossible. If water just is H2O, essentially, then it's impossible to be a fundamental element. So it doesn't matter for the sake of probabilistic reasoning what's possible or impossible. It's about what's conceivable relative to your background knowledge in the kind of Bayesian calculation. So I don't think this addresses the problem. And so this is kind of interesting because I said 60% of philosophers think zombies are conceivable, but most of those philosophers think, well, we can't infer that the zombies are possible from that. And we have this debate with people like David Chalmers and myself trying to infer from logical coherence to genuine possibility. The argument I'm giving today doesn't require any such contentious inference, because I think it's going to be a probabilistic argument, and I think what's relevant there is conceivability. So we're not going to be making any such contentious inferences. Don't worry about that if that's a bit more technical. Okay, 10 minutes. So, explanation 5. The big guy, Mr. G. God. So Brian Cutter and Dustin Crummett, two philosophers who have a very good paper arguing that God is the best explanation of psychophysical harmony. Their explanation is that dualism is true, and God fixed up the laws of nature, connecting the mental to the physical in such a way that there's a rationally appropriate connection. Okay, so I think this is at least in the ballpark of the right explanation, because I think we're trying to explain why these are connected in a rationally appropriate way. And they're postulating, well, there's a rational mind behind creation that set it up like that. A couple of problems, though, with this. I'm very motivated by the problem of evil, familiar problem, obviously huge debate, so that's my problem with at least the omni-God. But also we still have to ask, well, how did God do it? And I think the idea that God just made these she made these psychophysical laws, I think the psychophysical laws are, as Richard Swinburne has pointed to, are going to be incredibly complicated, right? If we're going to have to sort of fix it so that every behaviour is the vast variety of behaviour there might be, the vast variety of conscious states might be, they're always going to be hooked up in a more or less rational way. That's going to be incredibly complicated. In fact, I think, if God was going to do it, she'd do it the way I'm about to suggest. And that shows that actually God in an explanation of this is redundant. People are interested. I've debated Crummett and Cutter on these Christian and atheist YouTube channels. Richard Swinburne and I have also debated the problem of evil in relation to my book on the Unbelievable YouTube channel, after he kindly reviewed the book for the Times Literary Supplement. Lots of good philosophy YouTube out there nowadays. Okay. Right, final explanation, and the one I favour. So I hope you're probably not persuaded, but what I'm trying to say, when you really think clearly, it's not obvious why the behaviour that results from conscious state should be rationally appropriate. Why should that be? Okay, so here's my favourite explanation that I develop in the book, that matter is itself inherently rational. So we don't have a rational mind outside the universe, matter is itself inherently rational. So this is a form of panpsychism, Pan-Agentialist view, according to which fundamental physical entities are conscious, maybe particles or fields. Now, panpsychists don't generally think literally everything is conscious, but there will clearly be some. So the particles making this up might be conscious, but it doesn't mean the phone as a whole has its own consciousness. But clearly there are going to be some macro level entities that have their own unified conscious experience, like humans and other animals, or their brains perhaps. So that's the panpsychist view. In some circumstances, conscious particles, let's say, combine to make unified conscious entities. So the Pan-Agentialist is a development of panpsychism, a particular form of panpsychism, which says that physical entities with unified consciousness, like particles or the brains of organisms, are never compelled to behave, but are rather disposed to respond rationally to the character of their experience. So this might seem ridiculous to say a particle is rational. But what I want to say is, well, maybe you're thinking, it's because you're thinking of human rationality, which is very complex and the result of, involves mathematics and probabilistic reasoning and so on, deliberation. But I think rationality can exist in very simple forms. And I want to say the simplest form of rational response is, do what you feel like doing. I think that is a form of rational. If I feel like sitting down, one rational response is to sit down. Now, if you're a statistically normal human adult, you feel like doing something, you can deliberate and think, is this a good idea? Do I really want to lash out in anger? But if you're a very young infant and you want the cookie, you're going to try and get it, right? Because you can't deliberate and think, is this a good idea? Have I eaten too much? You're going to try and get it. So the basic idea is particles are sort of like kids. So just to try and make an analogy, let's pretend that snooker balls have unified consciousness. Probably panpsychists will think they don't, but let's pretend they do. Then we've got the white ball hitting the red ball, and the red ball shoots off across the table. Our standard way of thinking about things, the white ball compels the red ball to shoot across the table. On the Pan-Agentialist view, nothing compels anything. What happens is the white ball makes the red ball really want to shoot across the table, and the red ball responds rationally by following up on that desire. So basically take that and think about it at the level of particles or fields. So basically, particles have these desires to do things, and because they're so stupid, because they can't deliberate, they don't understand it, they inevitably follow their desires, and we get a predictable world. In the book, I connect this to Boudewijn quantum mechanics, if people are interested. It's not inevitably connected, but it just maybe solves some problems with Boudewijn quantum mechanics. Anyway, so why take this seriously? Well, because now, once you have this metaphysical view in the background, now all you need is natural selection, right? Because once you've got this idea that physical entities respond rationally to the character of their experience, now natural selection has a motivation to give us conscious understanding of the world and the right kind of desires, because we're going to respond rationally and survive well. Okay, that's the view. So basically, ultimately, I think this is a Bayesian argument. The likelihood principle derived from Bayes theory, if the evidence is more likely assuming theory A is true than it is assuming theory B is true, then the evidence supports theory A over theory B. I just think psychophysical harmony is incredibly unlikely without some kind of directedness towards rationality, whether that's God outside or whether that's matter being inherently rational. If there wasn't some directedness towards rationality, it's a bit like the fine-tuning argument, where if there wasn't some, then it's incredibly improbable that you would, in general, get this rationally appropriate connection, much more likely with some kind of directedness towards rationality. So the psychophysical harmony strongly evidentially supports some kind of directedness towards rationality. Very, very final, in the last 3 minutes, I just want to make a methodological claim that, a lot of people listening to this might be, even if they can't see what's wrong with the argument, you think, this can't be true, because I think people are happy to believe wild theories if there's hard data to support them, right, like quantum physics or relativity. But it's just some abstract philosophical argument. There's something that can't persuade you of such radical truths. I kind of agree with that methodology, but I would say there is hard data behind what the argument I've just been given. The reality of consciousness itself and what we know about it from the inside is hard data. It's not the data you can get from experiments, but it's real, and so any theory of reality has to accommodate it. And this might connect to Alyssa's very interesting articulation of methodology of metaphysics, that we should just look to physics or science more generally. You can correct me on how you articulate that. I want to say that's all important, but there's another fundamental source of data, the reality of our conscious experience and what we know about it from the inside. So what I'm most passionate about philosophically is we need to get to a point where we take both of these data points as seriously for theorizing about reality, both the data of experiments and what we know about consciousness from the inside. And once we take the data of consciousness as seriously as experimental data, then I think we'll become more open to being taken in wild directions by the data of consciousness. But still doesn't mean you'll buy my argument, but I want to suggest you shouldn't have any methodological concerns about a philosophical argument taking you to wild places, because this philosophical argument is built on solid data. Okay, thank you very much. I'm a bit early.
All right, so I'm going to start by considering a very general view of physical structure that is held in various more detailed forms by many philosophers and scientists. George and Rob would reject it. Alyssa perhaps would be sympathetic to it. So actually the little exchange you were having with Howard and Rob is sort of relevant to what I'm doing. So I'm not advancing this view so much as just putting it on the table in order to explore its implications for middle-sized significance, which is our topic. Okay, so weak emergence. I'm going to define a notion of weak emergence, and as you might anticipate, we're going to have a corresponding notion of strong emergence in a moment. So weak emergence is manifested when we have middle-sized things and events that first exhibit distinctive, you might say non-aggregative, don't read too much into that, distinctive properties and patterns of behavior, best explained through laws directly governing middle-sized entities themselves, but also are wholly physically realized or constituted by smaller entities, and third, conform to the causal closure of fundamental physics. All right, so what is meant by that third clause's notion of causal closure? It's sometimes expressed the way you have it here on the screen. Every physical effect has an immediate, sufficient physical cause. Insofar as it has a sufficient cause at all, every physical effect lacking a sufficient cause has its probability fixed by an immediate physical cause. What do we mean by physical cause? This is, philosophers debate this, but one way people try to pick out the relevant sense for the purpose that follows is to say causes, we might say, that are describable at and only at a sufficiently microscopic scale, perhaps physical chemistry and below. Immediate is inserted there to rule out mixed physical and mental causal histories, right? So we're always going to have a sequence of physical causes, a chain through time. And then sufficient is to preclude the necessity of non-physical contributions working alongside physical causes. All right, so physicalists who shy away from reductionist language emphasize that macroscopic behavior and patterns are best explained by macroscopic properties and laws. But on weak emergence, there is an asymmetrical dependence of the macro on the micro. Ontologically, weakly emergent macro states and behavior are derivative on this view. Although I won't take time to elaborate it, if you're familiar with John Conway's Game of Life, Cellular Automaton, there are various generalizations of it, I think these cellular automata vividly illustrate how emerging high-level patterns can be distinctive in form, underwriting similarly distinctive causal explanations, while not in any way altering or supplementing the basic dynamics here given by these three rules that drive the world's evolution. So the existence of weakly emergent middle-sized things is relatively uncontroversial. More controversial is whether there are strongly emergent entities. Perhaps we can explicate strong emergence this way. Philosophers fuss about this, and you'll see different ways of trying to formulate it. I'm going to do it disjunctively. So I'll say that strongly emergent behavior of a complex system occurs when reflecting a fundamental emergent law, either the parts of the system at some scale exercise in a coordinated fashion basic causal powers that they do not exercise outside the systemic context. I'll dub this collective fundamental difference making. Or two, perhaps the system itself has a novel, non-structural property or power, a primitive, right, macro level property that makes a difference to the system's activity that again is fundamental. That is, that's not determined by the sum in any sense of the activity of and relation among its parts. You could call this unitary fundamental difference making. So strongly emergent behavior, if such there be, which is very controversial, is not inexplicable, as is sometimes alleged. It's not reductively explicable, it is true, but where it occurs in ways that can be studied and eventually could be predicted on the basis of laws that link them in a dynamical co-evolution with certain structural kinds. All right, it seems to me that human and animal consciousness, and so here Philip and I are on the same page, But where I mean by this, not just experience, conscious experience, but also conscious attitudes and agency, is a highly plausible, and I would think the most plausible candidate for strong emergence. Even so, the considered view of many theorists is to deny it, deny that conscious experience is in fact strongly emergent, just because it entails the failure of causal closure of fundamental physics. But why should we believe the causal closure thesis? Some, like David Papineau, philosopher, infer it from the principle of the conservation of energy. All right, so now begins a very brief physics amateur hour, little interlude, but I'm quoting people who are far better informed than me. The conservation of energy, while Sean Carroll and co-author call it a cherished principle in physics, has a very uncertain status as an exceptionless principle even in physics. So I'm informed that it's known to fail for spontaneous collapse models of quantum mechanics. It appears also to fail for quantum measurement in Copenhagen and Everettian models, again according to Sean Carroll. And finally, Tim Maudlin has argued that in different physics contexts, and specifically when gravity is taken into account, there is, quote, no satisfactory way to define a useful notion of energy that is generically conserved. Now, if these claims by my informed betters are correct, I of course must defer to George here, the upshot seems to be that conservation laws are best seen nowadays as regulative rather than axiomatic principles, useful but often not essential, again quoting Maudlin. Further perspective on energy and momentum conservations provided by a recent article by Kusu and Pitts. They note that it is a consequence of Nether's theorems that there is conservation if and only if there are certain deep forms of time and space symmetry in physical processes. And within a modern physics context of continuous fields, the conservation laws are first and foremost a local, not global affair. Quote, given any region of space, the change of energy within that region equals the flow of energy across the boundaries of that region of space. Conservation will thus fail wherever there is a broken symmetry, which circumstance is always an open empirical question. And symmetry breaking is implied by the very claim of any localized factor, such as the consciousness of me, right here, intermittently affecting local energetic states, as the dualist stance of conscious minds affecting brains maintains. All right, so that's the end of Physics Amateur Hour. Now, Papineau speaks of the strong, who's an anti-strong emergentist. He speaks of the strong emergentist as being committed to mental force, and he complains we have no evidence of such a force. But I think that exertion of mental force and the associated concept of energy is the wrong way to think about the efficacy of the will or of consciousness more generally. Conscious states are sensitive to representational, informational content, and not mere physical energy as such. And they are at times causal influences on and effects of conscious choice. That said, I concede that we lack a good theoretical framework for conceiving conscious mind-brain interaction on a strong emergentist picture. Recent dualist conscious field theories interfacing with electromagnetic fields in the brain provide a start on such a model, but they seem better suited to perceptual states than to non-perceptual cognitive states or the capacity of choice. Okay, let me draw on these elements that I've introduced thus far in order to speak to the question of the significance of middle-sized things. So consider a, practically speaking, disinterested, disembodied, and computationally and observationally limitless Laplacian observer of a total world. A world that is devoid of conscious minds, where we grant the physicalist assumption of there being merely weak emergence as regards all non-conscious systemic behavior. Okay? So now you're imagining this hovering above the universe, so to speak, this ghostly mind. What significance would such an observer see in a landscape with intermittent, coarse-grained macroscopic patterns that, like all else, are wholly determined by the fundamental physical dynamics, whose swarming interstices he sees in perfect detail? I suggest the Laplacian observer would regard it as aesthetically interesting that you get these bubbling up macroscopic patterns here and there in this cosmos that's fundamentally determined by microphysics, but of no deep theoretical interest. The macroscopic laws describing such intermittent phenomena are wholly derivative. They are wholly unnecessary to explaining the distribution of matter energy, even in the vicinity of their limited application. And the fact that the initial conditions and fundamental driving factors of the cosmos tend to give rise here and there to pockets of material systems exhibiting such law-like coarse-grained patterns is itself entirely predictable, that is, to our marvelous observer. It would be entirely predictable. All right, now consider a modified scenario including embedded, strongly emergent conscious agents. To a very significant extent on the cosmic scale, it unfolds much as the first one did. Fundamental physical forces and processes giving rise to more or less pervasive, weakly emergent structures and processes. But it also has small eddies where strongly emergent, minded biological creatures fundamentally affect the physical processes in and around them. The immediate effects of their conscious states and decisions are not wholly fixed by the ordinary activity of the constituent entities in and around them at any scope. Finally, within such a strongly emergent scenario, consider how certain of the weakly emergent structures and processes, precisely those that are middle-sized, look to the interested and embedded, strongly emergent conscious agents themselves, perhaps ourselves if strong emergence is true of us. Their perspective, their beliefs and interests, and their consequent aims are largely or wholly shaped by middle-sized categories. Middle-sized objects and processes are of deep practical significance to them. And they are of theoretical significance too, since strongly emergent behavior makes a fundamental difference, and one cannot understand such behavior in theoretical terms apart from the agent's practical perspective. A total theory, right, on a strongly emergentist view, on a view on which you have strongly emergent conscious agents who are effective in the world, a minimally adequate theory of how the cosmos unfolds has to take account precisely of, because they're fundamental causal agents, has to take account of their influence, right, in addition to the ordinary microphysical dynamics, and you can't understand the activity of conscious agents apart from understanding how they're seeing the world and what they're attempting to achieve. So imagine a Laplacian observer of such a modified world. In order to formulate a minimal theoretical basis for the world's unfolding, he needs to refer to the middle-sized objects and properties that shape the activity of fundamental difference-making conscious agents. In short, since practical thought informs strongly emergent activity, its content must be integrated into one's theoretical understanding of what's happening. This suggests to me that enthusiasts of merely weakly emergent phenomena are not wrong to see them as of deep theoretical significance. It's just that they have misidentified it. The many varieties of weakly emergent structure have importance within the overall architectonic of the world, first, by providing a stable platform for strongly emergent structure, in some cases, as with the emergence of persons. And second, and much more generally, by providing a structured, middle-sized world for strongly emergent structures or entities to engage, including making possible, if we ourselves are such agents, our own scientific activity and theorizing. Students of the kind of abstract structure and dynamics that is wholly grounded in more basic processes, weakly emergent structure and dynamics, such students explore life worlds and other cellular automata as conscious knowers, hovering over the deep of these abstract constructions, grasping the varied macroscopic patterns that weakly emerge and their underlying basis. And as middle-sized agents themselves, they tend to ascribe significance to the structured patterns by analogy to the immediate practical significance that the real-world analogs of such patterns have for ourselves. It is significance to ourselves and to any other conscious knowers there may be, which knowers we implicitly take to transcend such patterns. If I'm correct, then, our question concerning the significance of middle-sized things turns on their significance to the conscious minds that do or might contemplate them. In a world with merely animal minds, the scope of middle-sized significance is restricted to the creatures themselves, their food sources, and salient features of their habitats as objects of their practical deliberation, planning, and choices. The addition of human consciousness dramatically widens the scope of middle-sized significance. It's not just the widened range of our practical activity. As this very conference illustrates, our collective theoretical, and we might add even aesthetic, interest is wider still, spanning from the heavens to the elements. The intentional content of our theoretical and practical attitudes affects our consciously directed activity in various ways. And so the very wide categorizations of middle-sized objects that we deploy will enter into a minimally adequate understanding of natural reality. Finally, suppose that theism is true. How might the reality of an all-knowing cosmic creator, not mere observer, impact the significance of middle-sized things? From God's perspective, creation is an integral unity, and we might well suppose that God chooses the fundamental physics in part for the sake of its subserving macroscopic patterns, and in particular, the value of sentient creatures, and specifically of intelligently choosing sentient creatures such as ourselves. If so, then certain middle-sized things and the structures needed to sustain them are, despite their very late appearance and tiny size relative to the cosmos, at the very center of theoretical and practical significance. Thanks.
Beginning to say a few things about Philip's talk. And I'm worried about this notion of agency that he uses, and I'm worried about it at two levels, the micro and the macro level. The micro level, in what sense is it free agency or agency at all if what a particle can do is restricted to one or two things, exercising a fixed mass or a fixed charge? And they actually never even choose to refrain from doing that, all those things. So it's absolutely certain that they will all the time do it. And there's no chance, not merely that they can do anything else, but they might even decide, I can already do that, I'm fed up with it, I won't even bother doing that. So that the idea that that's agency seems to be a very strange idea. Now, I don't want to say that if you never do anything other than what you do, you can't do something different. In an interesting way, I'd apply this to theology. A lot of people say that God cannot do wrong. My view would be, of course he could, but but it's absolutely 100% metaphysical certainty that it won't. And I don't think you could move from what doesn't happen and is never going to happen, and you can be sure never happens, to a modal conclusion, and there's no need for it in the God case. But that's a bit controversial. But I certainly think in the case of particles, it's very odd to think the thing is an agent at all. If what it does because something else, well, in some cases puts itself in the position of doing it, or if it's just sitting there being an electron, because it never does anything else, and there's no other option it could do, and there's nothing that it doesn't even stop and go to sleep. So that's a very strange use of agency, I think, altogether. He said it's very simple agency, pure act of will, but I mean, normally agency seems to presuppose some kind of decision process, even if a very elementary sort, and there's absolutely no such process. You might want to say that an electron really has quite an active mind, we just can't see it, but that's not what Philip wants to say. He doesn't want to attribute a sophistication there. Now, all the action that Philip considers, or seems to consider, is a kind of desire satisfaction, almost a kind of behaviour with consciousness included, a sort of stimulus response kind of thing. And that's obviously important, but that's not what we think of as being the whole of rationality, or indeed most of rationality. Rationality involves something that he never mentioned, and which panpsychists are cautious of mentioning, namely concepts. The grasp of universals, as well as the presence of conscious phenomena, as in the sensation case. And I've not come across any panpsychists. Most panpsychists do believe in cognitive phenomenology, as well as bare phenomenology, which people like James and Russell in the original forms of his neutral monism didn't. They were behaviourists about that, if they were anything, certainly Russell was. But if you're going to have cognitive psychology, phenomenology, and certainly if you're going to include the rationality in the conscious bit, you've got to have grasp of concepts. Grasp of concepts cannot be constructed unless you're a primitive imagist out of the sensations that you're having. So I don't see how you get to real rationality, even if you can imagine the thing being trained to avoid what it doesn't like because of the way it feels, or to go what it likes because of the way that feels. That's still not going to get you what's happening in our minds when Philip and I are having an argument about this sort of thing, which is conceptually driven, not driven by, unless you're going to be a kind of sort of Freudian reductionist. You know, any discussion is really just about what makes you feel good in some way or other. But if you're not going to go down that sort of way, then I don't see that any of that is being accommodated. Right. So that's. The kind of complexity that Philip wants, I don't see why a robot couldn't have it, more or less. In other words, you can do the same job by complexity of organisation, avoiding something that's damaging you or whatever. The consciousness is not really, doesn't have to be doing a lot of work. So that's my worry about Philip's. The trouble with Tim's talk is that I don't disagree with any of it at all. So I want to say I want to say some, as it were, elaborations of the thought. Peter van Inwagen denies the reality of complex physical objects altogether. They're just atoms arranged table-wise. I put it differently in something I wrote in 2016. I talk about conceptual reality and, as it were, real reality. Something is conceptually real if we've got a concept, and that concept fits the things it's meant to fit by and large. So the concept table fits what it's meant to fit. So tables are conceptually real. Things are really real if they're there whether we have any concepts or not. They're there just because they're there, as it were. And I agree with Tim. It's only if the world is closed under physics, that's the only really real bit. The rest is conceptually real if there's some point in noticing it, so to speak, or if you want to introduce the concepts. I want to make 2 points in connection with that. What would have to be the case for complex physical objects to be more than conceptually real? If you were an emergentist, a strong emergentist of the C.D. Broad type about chemistry, where when 2 or 3 are gathered together or more, as it were, in a molecule, it behaves in a way that physicists couldn't have predicted in principle, does that make molecules really real? Or is it just the case that after all, people show no properties if they're just on their own. Normally, you've got to interact with them to find there's a property there at all. And if they started showing extra properties when there were a lot of them interacting, would that mean that they were further objects, or just that they were still just collections of things that behaved differently when there were a lot of them near to each other? I think the only case in which you'd have to say there was a really real new object was if what it did had a teleological significance, say, for its own preservation or reproduction and all the rest of it. Because that only makes sense in the context of it being the sort of object that it is when it's come together. Whereas just in the chemical case, the C.D. Broad case, that's not so, I think. It just is when you get more of them, they behave in ways they wouldn't if they were on their own. So it would need something irreducibly teleological in order for that not to be, for there to be real objects further down. That, of course, would justify, wouldn't justify Peter van Immerwagen's attempt to say that despite him not believing in complex objects, he is real himself, and that organisms are real. But I don't think it does in his case, because he's a physicalist, and as I'm going to say in a minute, if it's just happening for the physical reasons, and understanding it teleologically implies a certain interpretation of what's going on, I'm not sure that it really would get him out of the problem. But I want to just mention, I think what's that, a minute or two left? Yeah, something that I argued in 2016 against Dennett. If you have this conceptualist picture, which is very, very similar to his interpretation of this picture of other minds, you've got to be a dualist, because if there's something doing the interpreting, it must, as it were, be an intentional system itself, a genuinely intentional system. And if complex objects that are purely physical are only conceptually real, we can't make ourselves real by understanding ourselves conceptually in a certain kind of way. And that's very like the reason which Hume decided his own theory of his version of the bundle identity didn't work. He thought complex objects were only real objects because we decided to group the things together. And you can't do that for yourself because there's nothing to do with the grouping together. Similarly, I think, so what Tim says is right, and it's an argument for dualism. Because the very fact that we can conceptually create these things means that we're different kinds of things out of the things that are only created conceptually while being complex. So I think that's an interesting, entirely consistent with what Tim says. So I'm sorry, my former colleague and good House lad, I'm disagreeing with, but I hope not unsympathetically, but asking how you deal with the real intellectual, rational side of the conceptual. And Tim, I have no nothing to say except yes, and even more.
Yeah, what I mean by rationality, I'm having a very crude notion. I just mean responding to reasons, thinking or acting as you have reason to do. And Howard said, well, if it's just pleasure, pain, that's just stimulus response. I don't think that's right. I think it's a very nuanced form of rationality. If something hurts, that gives you a reason to avoid it. And in responding to that, of course, often you do just respond, before you think about it. But insofar as you're consciously avoiding the pain, that is rational responsiveness. Likewise, when a cat goes for the dinner because it wants the pleasure, that is a very simple form of rational responsiveness. I think that's I think we just need to think carefully about why is it so obvious people are going to avoid pain. It's because it's obviously the rational thing to do. And we're just assuming that people are, if something's so obviously the rational thing to do, they're going to do it. But then, well, that needs explanation. Why should people respond rationally? Maybe we could explain that in evolution, but I said, no, evolution presupposes an answer to this. So that's one way. So I do think this is a form, it's not just what a robot has, it's a very simple form of rational responsiveness. Yes, it's very different in human beings, because, as Howard says, we have conceptual understanding of the world around us. What I want to say is, it's exactly, on this view, it's a wonderfully simple view. There's just one kind of causal principle. Things respond rationally to the character of their experience. But if you're a very simple animal or a particle, or that has one form, but that exact same disposition to respond rationally flowers in a very much richer way in a being that has conceptual understanding of the world around us. But it's the same disposition. So I want to say, me and the particle and the cat have the same disposition, but it manifests in a different way because I've got much more conceptual understanding. And how do you explain conceptual understanding? I don't know. I wasn't trying, I wasn't trying to explain everything. I'm trying to address a quite particular part. And I agree with Howard. There are deep challenges that Howard in his work has very well articulated. I didn't understand why, because I was going to mention God, and I don't understand. I mean, is this really agency if they would never have behaved differently? I mean, I'm not necessarily, I just discussed in the book whether this could be libertarian free will. You needn't necessarily think of this as libertarian free will, just rational responsiveness. But yeah, I mean, God, if you think of God as, could God have tortured children for fun? Or maybe if God's omnipotent, God has the ability to do that, but it's metaphysically impossible for God to do that. Whatever you say about the God case, I would say something similar about particles. In a sense, they have the ability to act otherwise, but they're never going to exhibit it. But anyway, even if you want to say they couldn't have acted otherwise, fine, it's not libertarian free will then, it's rational responsiveness. And yeah, very, very, very finally, I didn't say anything about how this connects to middle-sized objects, and that's because this view inevitably involves fundamental causation at the level of organisms. That's what you need to make sense of why we've evolved conscious understanding. So the idea is that it's not just the particles with the fundamental rational responsiveness. Any macro-level unified whole is also involving a sort of fundamental causation where it's rationally responding to the character of its experience. And then natural selection has a motivation to give us the right kinds of desires, the right kind of conscious conceptual understanding, so we respond rationally to it. So it does involve fundamental middle-sized causation.
All right, I'll just briefly comment. Howard suggested, so I spoke of weak emergence as ontologically derivative. I start off that way. And then I proposed that weakly emergent phenomena gets bootstrapped, you might say, into being of fundamental theoretical explanatory significance in the presence of strongly emergent subjects who treat them as practically and theoretically important. And Howard wondered, well, isn't this a kind of argument for substance dualism insofar as we, or minded creatures in general, alone have the ability to confer a kind of reality on other complex systems? Whether it's a kind of substance dualism, I'm not sure that you're going to automatically get that. Because it seems consistent that you could think of something along the lines of Aristotelian holomorphic entities, irreducible but materially composed entities, and say everything that I said here. So I'm not sure that you automatically get there. Now, yeah, thinking about the nature of subjectivity might push you towards a stronger kind of dualism.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right, that's all I'll say.
That's it. Do we need a manager?
I think we're managing without, aren't we? But if there's problems, I'll go around with them.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Philip, but that was such a beautiful talk, yeah, so I really love that. But I wanted to ask a question for Philip. Your talk was like fascinating.
I misidentified.
I didn't know if you said that I was a type B, or I didn't know if you were talking about ASEC because I think you had a picture.
No, I thought you were a type B as well.
But you
I
had
had
a
a
really nice
picture.
picture.
I didn't think that was you.
Okay.
But I thought you were type B. Sorry, I got that wrong.
Okay. Well, one thing you didn't mention, I mean, when you were complaining about the type A, is there are these dissociations. Like, there are people who have a sensation of pain, but then they don't want to, I mean, they don't actually withdraw from it, and then you have the dissociation in the other direction too. So I thought the type A physicalist should be connecting the two, and then, I mean, connecting one kind of pain. I mean, so pain is ambiguous between all of these different types of things, and then the sensation, which is the one that you're focusing on when you're talking about zombies or whatever, you know, going away, is just something that kind of comes along for the ride. So I don't have to make it rational that a person with that sensation that wants to withdraw. I just need to make it rational that the person that has the other kind of pain that's analytically connected to the desire to withdraw wants to withdraw, and then this other thing just comes along for the ride. I don't know.
Yes, no, that's
it. Do
it.
you talk about this kind of dissociations when you're talking about
Yeah.
this?
I should have said something about that. Just in case people don't know about this type A, type B thing, this is from David Chalmers. So type A physicalism is close, maybe, the analytic functionalist position I started off with. So type A physicalists think zombies are just logically incoherent. They just don't make sense. Whereas type B physicalists think, oh, they're perfectly logically coherent. They're just impossible. And for what it's worth, the latter is the more common position. But yeah, no, I should have said. So there do seem apparently empirical reasons to think people can have pain without it hurting. So I should have said what I'm talking about is the hurtiness. Is the insofar as you can distinguish the qualitative and the affective bit. I'm talking about the affective bit, the bit that feels bad. I'm saying, how come there's this connection between feeling bad and avoidance behaviour, which sounds like an odd question, but I really think that it isn't. But if you're a type A physicalist, you do just avoid this problem altogether. So maybe, and as I say, you could see this. My friend Keith Frankish, I think, you could see this as an argument for type A physicalism. Because look, if you don't say there's a definitional logical connection between feeling bad and avoidance, then it does seem a question. Well, why did they go together in that way? So you could turn my argument on its head, and we'd have to have a different argument about type A physicalism. I mean, doesn't it just seem that that's not what we mean when we say someone's in pain? Something that could be cashed out in terms of behaviour. That's not an argument. That's just a statement. Yeah. Oh, no, wait. That's not an argument. We could talk about that. But yeah, we don't necessarily disagree on this.
Okay. Richard.
First, just to correct a misapprehension, Philip kindly quoted an argument of mine saying that if there are to be contingent laws connecting conscious states and brain states, there would have to be thousands and thousands of separate laws. Now, I think the way you put it suggested that I was using that as an argument against God having created them. But I wasn't, in fact, doing that. On the contrary, my point was that only God could. It would need a rather God-minded person to create all of those laws. I was using it as an argument that it would be very difficult for us to discover those laws, because you wouldn't have enough instances of them to find out whether they are generally in operation.
Yes, no, you're quite right. I was thinking, I said that sort of on the fly, and I was thinking of exactly the misapprehension as I was saying it. But yes, I suppose I was saying just the similarity to what you said, that these laws would be incredibly complex, And then I was making the point, well, look, if we can have a simpler theory that explains this without incredibly complex laws, that would be better. So that, you know, the analogy to your argument was simply that these laws would be very complicated. But yeah, obviously I agree that you're not using it to argue against
How
God.
many people want to ask a question? Right. That's right.
Me?
Yeah.
Timothy, thank you for a very clear paper. I have three quick things. One is conservation of energy in this argument. Okay, whenever you say conservation of energy, you must ask on what scale are you talking about the energy, because the different scale is different. And if you have, for example, a crystal in which there are phonons, there is energy transfer from the crystal level to the phonon level. So in fact there's an interlevel transfer, and it is perfectly conceivable that a similar kind of thing would happen in a neuron, for instance, or whatever. So that's the first one. But also, Anderson famously talks about emergence as being due to broken symmetries. And Noether's theorem says that that symmetry is related to conservation of energy. So Anderson is saying energy will not be conserved, and it's probably related to what I was just saying. That's point number one.
This is
two.
Anderson, the Morris different guy. Yeah. Okay.
Point number two is that I talked about rational thoughts yesterday and the power of algorithms. But what I think is interesting in the general context of what we're talking today is that most people, and actually most causation in the brain, is not due to rational thoughts, it's due to narratives. And narratives are a form of explanation which help us to understand things and make sense of things. And there's a wonderful paper called Conviction Narrative Theory, which talks about the power of narratives and how they're causal in the context of the brain. That's the second point. And the final one is, when you were talking about weak and strong emergence, you didn't separate out synchronic and diachronic. And I think the argument of the reductionist is perhaps true in the case of synchronic coordinate. But the question is, what's the situation going to be in the next microsecond, which is, and I think it's in that context that the argument is right.
Good. Yes, I do think of strong emergence dynamically. Right. I think that's the right way to do it. Good. Survive that. Okay.
Richard, did you have a follow-up?
No, but I had a slightly different point to make. You argued that natural selection couldn't deal with the correlations you were talking about. I think following up point over there, we ought to be clear about just what the correlations are. Pain can be used in different senses. The word pain can be used in different senses. And sometimes it's used just as the name of the nociceptor, the bodily injury, and other times, especially of course by those who study bodily injuries, in a much more natural and common sense context, it's used to as a name of a kind of sensation connected to a desire to get rid of that sensation. Now, of course, it's not always connected with that, because there are some unfortunate people who don't have the desire to get rid of it when they have what seems to be the same sensation as normal people do. But it doesn't, not merely does it need a desire to get rid of the bodily injury, it also, in order to be useful, it also needs, the human agent needs to have a correct belief about what is causing this. And so, I think the way that you should phrase the connection is what is sufficiently puzzling, is that bodily injuries lead to sensations of a sort that most people desire to get rid of and are connected with a belief about how to do so. Now, natural selection could play a significant role in explaining explaining why that correlation exists. Because if there are people who don't have the desire to get rid of it, they have to be looked after so that they don't mind falling down the stairs and so on. And they would be quickly eliminated if there weren't people to look after them. And likewise, if natural selection didn't, and if evolution, if natural selection didn't produce right beliefs about the causes of our sensations, then also we'd be in trouble. Now, natural selection can only operate on what's thrown up by the genetic material at the bottom. And if the genetic material threw up anything that didn't have the desire to get rid of it, or didn't have the right beliefs, then indeed it would be eliminated. So, assuming that one of the things that genetic material throws out is that there are people who have the right desires and the right beliefs, then they are likely to survive. But if natural selection, if genes do throw up other sorts of desires and beliefs, then they would be quickly eliminated. And so it seems to me that natural selection can explain if the genetic material throws up competing sorts of people, why they are quickly eliminated. Now, of course, that isn't going to be the whole story, because one will want to know why among the material among what the genetic material throws out are people of the right sort, and maybe and that is something that does need explaining. But if it throws up all sorts of things, then natural selection can explain why many of them are eliminated.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I'll keep it quite quick.
Just quickly, I mean, I should have been clear. I mean, desire is also a bit ambiguous. It could mean something functional, behavioural, but insofar as we're just talking about a felt aversion, I suppose my issue is it's logically coherent to have a world where felt aversions lead to attraction behaviour and felt repulsions felt attractions lead to avoidance behaviour and felt repulsions lead to attraction behaviour. That's logically coherent, and the beliefs would all work in the same way, and those creatures would evolve to feel pleasure when their bodies are damaged. So we still need an explanation. I don't disagree with what you said needed an explanation, but I think we also need an explanation, strange as it sounds, why felt aversions lead to avoidance behaviour if there's no logical connection. That's,
I think we must move on, Richard. We've got to move on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So thanks to both of you. My question is for Philip, in fact, and I think it might be related to the two previous questions. So I think I'm one of the people who still have to be convinced that there's
most people.
And so I was just wondering whether you couldn't describe the relation between, I don't know, phenomenal experience and so pain avoidance behavior as an ordinary nomological regularity, and so what the crucial difference between that nomological regularity and other nomological regularities that we have in the world is.
Good. Yes. Well, you could think of it that way, but the point is, I want to say there's that nomological regularity. It reflects value considerations because it's rationally appropriate for pain to go with avoidance, pleasure to go with attraction. So this is striking that these things that are not logically connected happen to be connected in a value-laden way. So it's maybe a bit like the fine-tuning in physics. Think of all the numbers that could have come up in physics. They're the ones that are right for life, which is something of intrinsic importance. So like, how is value getting in the laws of physics, seemingly? So similarly, how it seems like how things have turned out respects value in the sense that rational appropriateness is an evaluative notion. That's the thought.
Okay, right.
We've got time for one more quick question. Well, you have to be quick. You can both question and answer, Father.
So I'm curious because I think this. I apologize for Philip again. Both talks are wonderful. I think I might be a Pan-Agentialist, but not a panpsychist. And I think there's a way of reading Aristotle to say that he would be as well, in the sense that why is it that Earth goes down? Because it has a natural desire to go down. That desire is not conscious laden, but a fundamental aspect of what the physical of what it is to be the sort of thing that is Earth. I think you could update that to something. What is it to be the sort of thing that is a electron, to be attracted to certain charges and avoid it from others? And as we go up the scale, then that fundamental notion of tendency, that fundamental notion of directedness, leads to a more complex vision that becomes consciousness. And I'm curious why you couldn't start with the agentialism, Pan-Agentialism, that builds at higher levels of consciousness. Why do you need to bring the consciousness down? What is the psyche doing at the lower level?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you could make sense of rational responsiveness without consciousness, then maybe you could do that. I'm not sure that's quite what you're saying, but I suppose also, I mean, you could have a view, and maybe a lot of people at this conference have this view, where there's just fundamental rational responsiveness, but it just pops up at higher levels, probably Tim's view. But I think the Pan-Agentialist view that would kind of solve the problem, I think. But this Pan-Agentialist view I described is a more simple, elegant, unified picture of reality, which I think is what makes it very attractive.
We now go for a simple, elegant cup of coffee. How long? What's the break length?
30 minutes, and we're going to record the whole like follow up. Back where we were before.